air of comic vexation. "What in the world do you mean by playing me such a wicked trick as that?" "Well, well, well, it can't be helped. Have we got any more of it, Benjamin?" "Not a drop, sir." "Not a drop!" echoed the doctor. "My dear madam, what excuses can I offer you? My clumsiness has made our little experiment impossible for to day. Remind me to order some more to morrow, Benjamin, and don't think of troubling yourself to put that mess to rights. I'll send the man here to mop it all up. Our stout friend is harmless enough now, my dear lady, in combination with a boarded floor and a coming mop. I'm so sorry, I really am so sorry to have disappointed you." With those soothing words he offered his arm and led Miss Gwilt out of the dispensary. "Have you done with me for the present?" she asked, when they were in the hall. "Oh, dear, dear, what a way of putting it!" exclaimed the doctor. "Dinner at 6," he added, with his politest emphasis, as she turned from him in disdainful silence, and slowly mounted the stairs to her own room. A clock of the noiseless sort, and capable of offending irritable nerves, was fixed in the wall above the first floor landing at the Sanitarium. At the moment when the hands pointed to 1/4 before 6, the silence of the lonely upper regions was softly broken by the rustling of Miss Gwilt's dress. She advanced along the corridor of the first floor, paused at the covered apparatus fixed outside the room numbered 4, listened for a moment, and then unlocked the cover with the duplicate key. The open lid cast a shadow over the inside of the casing. All she saw at first was what she had seen already, the jar, and the pipe and glass funnel inserted in the cork. She removed the funnel, and, looking about her, observed on the window sill close by a wax-tipped wand used for lighting the gas. She took the wand, and, introducing it through the aperture occupied by the funnel, moved it to and fro in the jar. The faint splash of some liquid, and the grating noise of certain hard substances which she was stirring about, were the two sounds that caught her ear. She drew out the wand, and cautiously touched the wet left on it with the tip of her tongue. Caution was quite needless in this case. The liquid was water. In putting the funnel back in its place, she noticed something faintly shining in the obscurely lit vacant space at the side of the jar. She drew it out and produced a purple flask. The liquid with which it was filled showed dark through the transparent coloring of the glass, and fastened at regular intervals down one side of the flask were 6 thin strips of paper, which divided the contents into 6 equal parts. There was no doubt now that the apparatus had been secretly prepared for her, the apparatus of which she alone, besides the doctor, possessed the key. She put back the flask and locked the cover of the casing. For a moment she stood looking at it, with the key in her hand. On a sudden her lost color came back. On a sudden its natural animation returned, for the first time that day, to her face. She turned and hurried breathlessly upstairs to her room on the second floor. With eager hands she snatched her cloak out of the wardrobe, and took her bonnet from the box. "I'm not in prison!" she burst out impetuously. "I've got the use of my limbs. I can go, no matter where, as long as I am out of this house." With her cloak on her shoulders and her bonnet in her hand, she crossed the room to the door. A moment more, and she would have been out in the passage. In that moment the remembrance flashed back on her of the husband whom she had denied to his face. She stopped instantly, and threw the cloak and bonnet from her on the bed. "No," she said, "the gulf is dug between us. The worst is done." There was a knock at the door. The doctor's voice outside politely reminded her that it was 6 o'clock. She opened the door, and stopped him on his way downstairs. "What time is the train due to-night?" she asked in a whisper. "At 10," answered the doctor, in a voice which all the world might hear and welcome. "What room is Mr. Armadale to have when he comes?" "What room would you like him to have?" "Number 4." The doctor kept up appearances to the very last. "Number 4 let it be," he said graciously, "provided, of course, that Number 4 is unoccupied at the time." The evening wore on, and the night came. At a few minutes before 10, Mr. Bashwood was again at his post, once more on the watch for the coming of the tidal train. The inspector on duty, who knew him by sight, and who had personally ascertained that his regular attendance at the terminus implied no designs on the purses and portmanteaus of the passengers, noticed two new circumstances in connection with Mr. Bashwood that night. In the first place, instead of exhibiting his customary cheerfulness, he looked anxious and depressed. In the second place, while he was watching for the train, he was, to all appearance, being watched in his turn by a slim, dark, undersized man who had left his luggage, marked with the name of Midwinter, at the custom house department the evening before, and who had returned to have it examined about half an hour since. What had brought Midwinter to the terminus? And why was he, too, waiting for the tidal train? After straying as far as Hendon during his lonely walk of the previous night, he had taken refuge at the village inn, and had fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion towards those later hours of the morning which were the hours that his wife's foresight had turned to account. When he returned to the lodging, the landlady could only inform him that her tenant had settled everything with her, and had left, for what destination neither she nor her servant could tell, more than 2 hours since. Having given some little time to inquiries, the result of which convinced him that the clue was lost so far, Midwinter had quitted the house, and had pursued his way mechanically to the busier and more central parts of the metropolis. With the light now thrown on his wife's character, to call at the address she had given him as the address at which her mother lived would be plainly useless. He went on through the streets, resolute to discover her, and trying vainly to see the means to his end, till the sense of fatigue forced itself on him once more. Stopping to rest and recruit his strength at the first hotel he came to, a chance dispute between the waiter and a stranger about a lost portmanteau reminded him of his own luggage left at the terminus, and instantly took his mind back to the circumstances under which he and Mr. Bashwood had met. In a moment more, the idea that he had been vainly seeking on his way through the streets flashed on him. In a moment more, he had determined to try the chance of finding the steward again on the watch for the person whose arrival he had evidently expected by the previous evening's train. Ignorant of the report of Allan's death at sea, uninformed at the terrible interview with his wife of the purpose which her assumption of a widow's dress really had in view, Midwinter's first vague suspicions of her fidelity had now inevitably developed into the conviction that she was false. He could place but one interpretation on her open disavowal of him, and on her taking the name under which he had secretly married her. Her conduct forced the conclusion on him that she was engaged in some infamous intrigue, and that she had basely secured herself beforehand in the position of all others in which she knew it would be the most odious and most repellent to him to claim his authority over her. With that conviction he was now watching Mr. Bashwood. Firmly persuaded that his wife's hiding-place was known to the vile servant of his wife's vices, and darkly suspecting as the time wore on that the unknown man who had wronged him and the unknown traveler for whose arrival the steward was waiting were one and the same. The train was late that night, and the carriages were more than usually crowded when they arrived at last. Midwinter became involved in the confusion on the platform, and in the effort to extricate himself he lost sight of Mr. Bashwood for the first time. A lapse of some few minutes had passed before he again discovered the steward talking eagerly to a man in a loose shaggy coat, whose back was turned toward him. Forgetful of all the cautions and restraints which he had imposed on himself before the train appeared, Midwinter instantly advanced on them. Mr. Bashwood saw his threatening face as he came on, and fell back in silence. The man in the loose coat turned to look where the steward was looking, and disclosed to Midwinter, in the full light of the station lamp, Allan's face. For the moment they both stood speechless, hand in hand, looking at each other. Allan was the first to recover himself. "Thank God for this!" he said, fervently. "I don't ask how you came here; it's enough for me that you have come. Miserable news has met me already, Midwinter. Nobody but you can comfort me and help me to bear it." His voice faltered over those last words, and he said no more. The tone in which he had spoken roused Midwinter to meet the circumstances as they were, by appealing to the old grateful interest in his friend which had once been the foremost interest of his life. He mastered his personal misery for the first time since it had fallen on him, and, gently taking Allan aside, asked what had happened. The answer, after informing him of his friend's reported death at sea, announced, on Mr. Bashwood's authority, that the news had reached Miss Milroy, and that the